You wake up, gasping, drenched in sweat. Not because of a nightmare, but because your body knows something your mind has not yet remembered. You check the time. You have been asleep for 3 hours and 7 minutes. That is 4 minutes over the limit. In this world, those 4 minutes can cost you everything. Within seconds, your home's biometric scanner activates, silently alerting central enforcement. You leap from bed, trying to look coherent, trying to wash the sleep from your face. Your hands are shaking. Your thoughts are foggy. But it is too late. Outside your window, a black, silent drone hovers, its red light fixed on you. In this timeline, the year is 2047, and the world has made sleep illegal. Not entirely, just mostly. The new maximum limit. 3 hours per 24-hour cycle. Anything more, and you are breaking the law. Not a suggestion, not a health guideline. A criminal offense. And it does not matter if you are a child, an elder, a student, a surgeon, a soldier, or a mother with a newborn. The rule is universal. The Sleep Regulation Act passed without warning, and enforcement began within days. You are expected to adjust. Everyone is. No exception. Your body screams for rest, but society demands your wakefulness. Welcome to the nightmare you do not get to sleep through. This is not just sleep deprivation. This is a state-mandated erasure of rest, dreams, and repair. You are now a cog in a machine that never stops turning. And if your eyes close too long, you are the one getting crushed. Imagine you are living in the near future. The year is 2047. At first, nothing seems unusual. The buildings are taller, cities brighter, and AI assistants more capable than ever. But something is wrong. People walk with dead stares. Streets are crowded, yet eerily silent. Are filled with exhausted figures, sipping military-grade stimulants instead of coffee. The world never sleeps anymore, not because it doesn't want to, but because it is no longer allowed to. Humanity has officially declared war on sleep, and you are now a soldier in a battle against your own biology. It all began as a radical movement championed by corporate lobbies and productivity think tanks, arguing that sleep was an outdated evolutionary trait. Imagine the potential of a fully awakened workforce, they claimed. At first, governments hesitated. After a series of economic collapses, environmental disasters, and growing distrust in automation, nations were desperate for control, for production, for progress. And sleep, they decided, was the bottleneck. The United Nations ratified the Sleep Regulation Act, legally limiting all citizens to no more than 3 hours of rest per day. It was hailed as a revolutionary leap toward global productivity and hailed as the wake age. At first, the headlines sold it as empowerment. No more wasted hours. Master your mind. Maximize your time. But within weeks, the public began to unravel. Scientists were silenced. Sleep clinics were shut down. Medications were restricted. Schools, hospitals, and entire industries were forced to restructure. And anyone who resisted, they vanished. The world is now governed by an ideology that sees rest as weakness and dreams as disobedience. As you stand in this sleepless society, ask yourself, could you survive without sleep? Not by choice, but by law. Would your body obey? Would your mind? Or would you, like billions of others, begin to fracture in ways you could never imagine? To understand how you got here and why survival is nearly impossible, we need to go back to the beginning. The day the law passed and humanity made the fatal decision to abandon the one thing it truly needed: rest. The shift came not with an explosion, but with a signature. On January 19th, 2047, the Unified Earth Council ratified Resolution 88-47, better known as the Sleep Regulation Act. It was broadcast globally as a necessary recalibration of human potential, veiled in the language of productivity and progress. The announcement was sleek, clinical, and emotionless, delivered by AI-generated spokespersons across synchronized news networks. To ensure equality of labor, optimize bioefficiency, and unlock the next phase of global evolution, they said, all citizens will henceforth be limited to 3 hours of rest in every 24-hour cycle. What most people didn't know was that the resolution had been drafted years earlier, buried beneath a pile of corporate white papers. Military bio-readiness, experiments, and internal government research on sleep suppression. The data was damning. Sleep was no longer viewed as a human need, but as a liability, a vulnerability, a glitch in the human machine that needed to be patched. At first, the public did not react violently. People were stunned, confused, and disoriented. The official messaging was powerful and relentless. "The world has changed," said one ad. "Are you keeping up?" The promise of advancement drowned out the screams of science. Corporations lined up to support the initiative. Pharmaceutical giants pushed new lines of stimulants. Tech firms released wearable wakefulness bands that tracked compliance in real time. Sleep tech companies rebranded, offering 3-hour hyper-rest pods with claims of brain optimization. In the first week, the stock market soared. Global GDP projections were revised upward. News anchors celebrated the end of wasted time. But beneath the surface, something in the global psyche began to crack. Enforcement began almost immediately. Cities were divided into sleep grids, monitored by biometric trackers embedded in homes, workplaces, and public spaces. Anyone who exceeded their sleep quota, even by minutes, was flagged by the central network and received a formal violation warning. Repeat offenses triggered audits, employer notifications, and, eventually, government intervention. Surveillance AI was upgraded to detect patterns of inactivity and slowed brain function. Infrared cameras and pulse sensors became standard in bedrooms. The term sleep crime entered common vocabulary. People began to fear rest. Alarm clocks were replaced by nerve shock bracelets. Hospitals issued public warnings: sleep responsibly. In those early days, resistance was fragmented and largely silenced. Sleep scientists who questioned the act were accused of spreading anti-productivity propaganda and stripped of their research grants. Some fled, others vanished. A few managed to leak internal documents revealing the consequences of chronic sleep loss, but they were quickly labeled as extremists. Meanwhile, government-endorsed influencers flooded social media with content on sleep discipline, teaching users how to meditate while awake, how to trick the body into thinking it had rested, how to rewrite your DNA for optimal uptime. Children were taught in school that needing more than 3 hours made you defective, weak, lazy. Culture adapted frighteningly fast. Movies portrayed sleep as addiction. Novels romanticized eternal wakefulness. And the average person, scared and overwhelmed, tried desperately to conform. By the 3rd month, the psychological toll began to emerge. Sleep clinics were flooded with people experiencing auditory hallucinations, violent mood swings, and emotional flatlining. But they were quickly converted into compliance centers, retraining patients instead of treating them. Employers began docking pay for suspected oversleeping. Entire neighborhoods were subjected to nighttime patrols by autonomous drones. Cities never dimmed their lights anymore. Blue light illuminated every street, every home, every sky. Darkness itself was treated as a threat. Earth was no longer a planet that slept. It had become a machine running without pause, without breath, without balance. You, like everyone else, received your Comply Watch, a sleek wrist device that monitored your vital signs, logged sleep windows, and reported violations automatically. Your sleep record was linked to your identification card, employment, eligibility, and even your ability to purchase groceries. Cue many red flags, and your access to society began to vanish. People spoke quietly of neighbors who were decommissioned, a euphemism for either institutionalization or something far worse. Rumors spread about wake camps where violators were sent for re-education. No one who went ever returned. The worst part, most people still believed it was temporary, that it would be revised, that common sense would prevail. But the law held strong. It had become too profitable, too embedded in the world order. Industries were now structured around a sleepless humanity. Governments had tied national security to round-the-clock citizen functionality. There was no going back. The law had done more than criminalized sleep. It had erased it as a human right. But if passing the law was the ignition point, the first week that followed was the detonation. That was when society began to unravel at every seam, and no one, not even those who helped draft the law, could stop what came next. The first 72 hours after the Sleep Regulation Act went into effect were a blur. Not just for individuals, but for entire cities. It was as if society had suddenly been dipped into a fog of confusion and raw biological panic. People tried to comply. They set alarms. They took pills. They tried to keep working, driving, talking, functioning. But 3 hours of sleep was not enough, not even close. The human brain, denied its essential maintenance cycle, began to retaliate almost immediately. By the end of the first day, hospital emergency rooms overflowed with patients experiencing microsleep blackouts. They had fallen asleep mid-conversation, mid-step, mid-air, while driving. The accidents were so widespread that traffic collapsed. Air travel was grounded. Supply lines froze. Surgeons in the middle of procedures suddenly dropped their instruments and passed out. Elevator operators forgot how to operate controls. Children in classrooms slumped over their desks and began twitching. Their tiny bodies unable to fight the pool of sleep any longer. News broadcasts, once filled with proud declarations about the new era, began showing raw footage of chaos, collapsed buses, overturned ambulances, screaming passengers in subways where operators had fallen unconscious. But no one was allowed to publicly criticize the law. The networks carefully framed these incidents as adjustment turbulence. They said the human mind just needed to learn a new rhythm. They said this was progress, and progress always came with discomfort. Behind the scenes, however, city officials were already panicking. Local governments issued sleep stabilization protocols advising citizens to stay indoors, avoid operating machinery, and consume only approved neural stimulants. Pharmacies were emptied. People lined up for miles to receive their government-issued awakening tabs, a blend of synthetic amphetamines and nootropics that kept you conscious but made your skin crawl and your teeth chatter uncontrollably. By day 4, the streets no longer felt human. People moved like husks, eyes bloodshot, speech slurred, balance faltering. Sleepwalking became so common it was no longer distinguishable from wakefulness. Fistfights erupted at intersections over caffeine rations. Mothers sobbed in the aisles of hypermarts as their toddlers collapsed into unresponsive states. The few who tried to sleep longer, out of desperation or disbelief were swiftly punished. Drones patrolled homes using thermal scans and pulse monitors. If anyone's body remained too still for too long, enforcement agents were dispatched. Videos began circulating online of citizens being dragged from their beds and forced into restraint. Chairs for compliance recalibration. A viral clip showed a teenage boy being jolted awake repeatedly by a machine that screamed motivational phrases while administering electric shocks. The caption read, "Choose to wake." The black market began to emerge almost instantly. Some people had hidden sleep tech, old machines that could induce REM cycles in under an hour, long since outlawed. Others began selling sedatives that were stronger and more dangerous than anything legally available. Secret nap rooms appeared behind laundromats and auto garages. People began paying outrageous amounts just to close their eyes in peace for 20 minutes. But even in these havens, the fear was constant. If you were caught using an illegal sleep method, the punishment was not just a fine. You were labeled an unfit participant in the wake economy. That meant job termination, blacklisting, and in some cases, disappearance. Meanwhile, the workplace transformed overnight. Companies installed AI systems to monitor employee eye movements and brainwave irregularities. Bathroom mirrors were replaced with facial scanners that measured drowsiness. If your energy levels fell below the acceptable threshold, you were reported for reconditioning. Employees no longer spoke of being tired. They spoke of drift risk. Coworkers who drifted too often were escorted out by internal compliance officers in sleek, dark uniforms. Nobody ever knew where they were taken. Offices installed standing desks only. Chairs were banned in public service buildings. Even parks removed benches and installed alert poles that emitted painful, high-frequency tones if you lingered too long. For parents, the chaos was its own kind of hell. Children are biologically incapable of functioning on only 3 hours of rest. They began collapsing in terrifying ways, seizing, vomiting, hallucinating. Some stopped speaking altogether. Pediatric hospitals were overrun and then quietly emptied. Families were offered home monitoring pods for their kids, which were simply brightly colored sensory deprivation cells with built-in neurostimulators. They didn't work. Parents knew that. But if you didn't use them, child services could take your child for known compliance. Reports started to surface about special state-run facilities for developmentally non-compliant minors. Few believed these places actually helped kids. Most believed they were where children were sent to die quietly. Society's facade began to crack. Churches, synagogues, mosques, places once reserved for spiritual reflection, transformed into rest, abstinence centers. Sermons no longer preached peace. They preached alertness, resilience, duty. God stays awake to watch over you, one preacher said. Should you do any less? Public speakers collapsed on stage mid-sentence. Celebrities live-streamed 24-hour challenges as propaganda, pretending they had adapted while behind the scenes. They were given neural implants to keep them from losing consciousness. But no matter how hard people tried, the human mind could not keep up. Early signs of psychosis emerged across populations. People reported vivid waking dreams, inability to distinguish reality, and strange time distortions. Some claimed they could see things that weren't there, figures watching them, shadows that never moved, whispers that followed them from room to room. Scientists would have explained this as a result of REM suppression, but science was no longer in charge. The illusion of control had replaced truth, and denial had become the global default. Still, the government remained firm. If the problem was people resisting, then the solution was enforcement. That is when the sleep police arrived, and survival became not only impossible, but illegal. By the second week of the Sleep Regulation Act, the government no longer relied on public cooperation. It had become clear that society was collapsing under the weight of forced wakefulness, and voluntary compliance was no longer effective. That is when they deployed the Sleep Compliance Force, better known by their street name, the Sleep Police. They arrived not as an announcement, but as a shadow. Unmarked trucks rolled through cities under the cover of night, releasing teams of enforcers clad in matte gray armor, with biometric visors and neural dampeners. They didn't speak. They didn't warn. They simply entered homes, schools, offices, even public restrooms. Any place where someone might have drifted into unauthorized rest. Within days, the world transformed into a surveillance state, where the simple act of closing your eyes too long could bring armed men crashing through your door. Every home was retrofitted with monitoring devices. Even the poorest neighborhoods had sleep sensors bolted to every ceiling. These machines tracked everything: your eye movement, heart rate, breathing, even the twitch of muscles in your legs. They could detect when you were slipping into stage 1 sleep within seconds, and they would trigger a chain reaction, alerting a local compliance station, dispatching aerial surveillance drones, and marking your personal ID as a live offender. The most terrifying part: there was no appeal process. Once flagged, you were guilty. And if your record showed multiple violations, your case was escalated to what was euphemistically called targeted wake enforcement. The sleep police operated with a brutal efficiency that made them indistinguishable from death squads. Their vans were soundproof. Their uniforms had no visible insignia. They carried electroshock restraints and stimulant injectors, and in some cases, neural disruptors, devices that emitted frequencies designed to jolt the brain out of theta wave activity, forcing instant alertness. These were used on people found in deep sleep. But there were darker rumors, too, about quiet rooms where chronic offenders were taken to have parts of their hypothalamus permanently disabled, removing their ability to feel tired altogether. These weren't publicized. They weren't admitted to. But people began disappearing, and fear spread faster than truth. At the center of this system was the Global Wake Network, a vast AI-driven infrastructure that analyzed billions of biometric data points in real time. Every citizen was scored based on their wakefulness reliability. This WQ, or wake quotient, replaced traditional metrics like credit scores, academic achievement, or work history. Employers now hired based on WQ. Housing applications were approved based on WQ. Even access to dating platforms and public transportation required a minimum score. Those with low WQ were labeled slip risks and could be detained without cause under the pre-exhaustion protocol, which allowed enforcement to neutralize individuals suspected of being close to involuntary sleep. Sleep police presence became part of daily life. They stood motionless in banks, supermarkets, subway platforms. At schools, they monitored children using it-tracking software and facial fatigue detection. If a child failed to respond fast enough in class, they were escorted out. Families tried to protest, but those protests were shut down before they even began. Some parents resorted to training their children like athletes, scheduling sleep deprivation drills, pumping them full of focus drugs, and practicing alarm reaction exercises to avoid triggering violations. It didn't always work. Some children simply couldn't survive the pressure. The death rate among minors became a whispered statistic, never printed, but widely feared. Public demonstrations were rare and short-lived. The first major protest, known as the March of the Sleepers, took place in Berlin. Thousands of people staged a coordinated nap-in at Alexanderplatz. They laid down in perfect silence and closed their eyes in peaceful defiance. Within 8 minutes, aerial drones dropped neuroshock gas over the square. Hundreds were hospitalized with burns, convulsions, and nerve damage. Several died on live broadcasts. The message was clear. Sleep was treason. Any deviation from the 3-hour limit was treated as biological insubordination. You weren't just resisting the law, you were resisting the very definition of modern citizenship. Meanwhile, entertainment adapted. Reality shows emerged where contestants were forced to stay awake under punishing conditions, competing for money and medical exemptions. Celebrities released wake discipline videos, claiming they had found peace in the new lifestyle. Though leaked footage often showed them collapsed backstage, twitching and incoherent. Children's cartoons featured heroes who never slept. School textbooks removed all references to sleep as restorative. Instead, portraying it as a dangerous addiction of past generations. And yet, despite the constant oversight, enforcement, and propaganda, people kept breaking down. Bodies collapsed in public. Brains glitched. Entire buildings had to be evacuated because staff members entered mass microsleep events simultaneously. In response, the sleep police began deploying new AI-piloted drones called vigilance. These floating enforcers hovered silently overhead, scanning crowds for biometric anomalies and delivering instant electropulse interventions if signs of sleep were detected. Cities buzzed with their hum, and people instinctively looked down when they passed overhead. The fear was no longer hypothetical. It was in the air, in your blood, in every forced smile and jittery movement. And yet, the law persisted. People still tried to hold jobs, raise children, make friends, but behind every action was the looming dread of punishment. You could no longer trust your own body. You couldn't trust your neighbors either. A growing network of civilian informants began reporting violators for perks, better food rations, stimulant upgrades, or housing access. Families turned on each other. Friends vanished overnight, and the sleep police expanded their reach with every report. But while the enforcement grew stronger, so did something else, something far more dangerous than broken laws. The very fabric of human cognition began to fray, because the real enemy was not the police, the AI, or the law. It was your own mind, and your mind was about to declare war on you. As the world descended into sleepless chaos, a new kind of empire rose from the ashes of the human mind. Corporations, those faceless giants that once vied for market share, had become the undisputed rulers of Earth, and they loved the law. With sleep reduced to a crime and productivity turned into virtue, companies no longer measured their value by what they produced, but by how long their human capital remained operational. The 3-hour sleep limit was not seen as a crisis, but as a divine opportunity. Corporations had always dreamed of the day when they could eliminate inefficiencies, and sleep was the last great inefficiency. The Sleep Regulation Act gave them permission to build a world where workers never stopped working, where time itself could be mined like gold. Headquarters of the world's top tech and logistics firms expanded into mega complexes. Vertical cities humming with artificial light, synthetic oxygen, and soundproof cubicles. Inside these massive structures, employees lived, worked, exercised, ate, and were monitored 24 hours a day. There were no night shifts anymore because there was no night. Circadian rhythm was obsolete. Lighting systems were engineered to suppress melatonin production entirely. Hallways pulsed with soft blue light designed to trick the brain into thinking it was always morning. Conference rooms rotated between departments in 3-hour blocks, meaning work never stopped. Projects moved forward at breakneck speed. Deadlines vanished because time was continuous. If your body lagged, you were issued an alert. If your mind drifted, a stimulant mist was sprayed from ceiling vents. If you collapsed, you were quietly wheeled away and replaced. The people running these corporations were no longer considered CEOs. They had become architects of a new society. Governments, weakened by dependency on private infrastructure, handed over more and more control. Legislation was now drafted in collaboration with corporate boards. Court systems were outsourced to arbitration panels composed of business consultants. The line between public and private had disintegrated, and in its place emerged a singular philosophy: efficiency is survival. Those who could not keep up were not simply unemployed. They were considered biologically obsolete. Inside these gleaming towers, you would find wake chambers, sleek booths where employees could receive brain-activating shocks, nutrient injections, or mind-stretching VR simulations designed to prevent mental collapse. Gone were break rooms and sleeping pods. In their place were recharge units, where workers sat in ergonomic chairs that blasted them with audiovisual stimulation and artificial endorphins to override exhaustion. Meals were replaced with intravenous nutrient feeds. Taste, texture, pleasure, all stripped away. Eating became a chore, done without stopping work, just like breathing. Conversations were monitored to ensure no one expressed fatigue. Speaking the word tired was considered a violation of corporate speech protocols. Language was cleansed. You no longer said you were tired. You said your neural loop was fluctuating. If your performance fell, you were sent to wake correction, where your brain was stimulated to reprogram motivation pathways. Some returned. Some did not. The irony: corporate productivity charts did surge for a while. Output levels doubled in the first few months. Software was developed faster. Orders shipped quicker. Products launched at record speed. Shareholders celebrated. Investment poured in. But beneath the polished reports, the cost was bleeding out everywhere. Projects had to be reworked 3 times more often due to mistakes caused by sleep-deprived errors. Customer service agents began hallucinating, responding to questions with gibberish or screaming fits. Engineers left code littered with critical bugs they could no longer understand. Doctors in private hospitals administered the wrong medications. Finance workers lost billions through spreadsheets filled with impossible numbers. The illusion of progress masked a system rotting from within. And still, the executives pressed forward. Marketing campaigns framed these failures not as malfunctions, but as growth opportunities. One megacorporation released an ad featuring a worker who coded for 200 hours straight before dying at his desk. The tagline: "He dreamt with his eyes open." The ad went viral. The man's family received a wakefulness bonus. His death was branded a corporate martyrdom. Factories, now fully automated, still required human overseers. These humans sat in chairs bolted to the floor, strapped in place with biometric cuffs that monitored alertness. If they slouched, the chairs administered a spine-jolting vibration. If they nodded off, alarms screamed in their ears. Floors were lined with impact foam to absorb the bodies of those who fell. Managers were encouraged to create wake incentive games, where workers could win synthetic dopamine doses for maintaining perfect focus. In one instance, a factory in India introduced the zero blink hour. If no one blinked for 60 minutes, the entire floor received a 2-minute music burst. It became the most anticipated event of the week. Elsewhere, agriculture corporations use genetically modified laborers, bioengineered humans bred with suppressed melatonin genes. These people had never known real sleep. Raised in isolation, they were released into the fields like machines. They harvested crops in silence, eyes dry, skin burned by sun lamps that never dimmed. When they died from neural collapse, their bodies were left in the soil as compost. The farms were praised as sustainable. Retail chains introduced 24/7 service models where employees rotated through 9-hour work loops with 3-hour micro-rests in observation chambers. These sleep cages were lined with transparent walls so managers could ensure no one drifted beyond their limit. Customers began to notice. Clerks blinked out of sync, spoke in echoes, or stared through you as if you were not real. In one viral clip, a cashier at a megamart collapsed while scanning groceries, then stood up and continued scanning the same item for 27 minutes before anyone noticed. And yet, consumers adapted. The public had been conditioned. Fatigue was no longer seen as a sign of imbalance, but as evidence of loyalty. Wearing eye bags was considered patriotic. The phrase "live awake, die useful" was printed on shirts, mugs, phone cases. Corporations sold it as pride. They even sponsored funerals. Branded coffins featured slogans like "Forever Awake" or "He served without slumber," and families accepted it. Because in a world where sleep was forbidden, death had become the only place left to rest. Perhaps most disturbing was the spiritual void this culture created. Once, people dreamed in sleep of love, of hope, of something better, but now dreams were gone. No one remembered what it meant to imagine. Without REM cycles, creativity plummeted, art vanished, music became algorithmic noise, literature was auto-generated templates, films followed one of 10 government-approved plots. The soul of society had been gutted in exchange for uptime. You walk through one of these corporate towers now, and you see bodies technically alive, but hollow. Their fingers type. Their mouths move. Their eyes are open. But inside, there is nothing, just loops of command and compliance. They are not working to live. They are working to delay collapse. But collapse was coming anyway. Because while corporations thrived on the backs of the sleepless, the human brain was deteriorating fast. And soon, the mind itself would begin to fail in ways even technology could not stop. It began quietly, and then all at once. After months of forced wakefulness, something fundamental inside the human brain began to uncoil. Like a taut wire snapping under stress, the mind no longer responded to commands or corrections. Logic bent, memory faded, personality dissolved. What came next was not rebellion, but fragmentation. A collapse so complete that no device, law, or drug could reverse it. Sleep, once dismissed as a luxury, revealed itself to have been the very thread that kept humanity from disintegrating. And now that thread was gone. Inside the average human skull, chaos bloomed. Brain scans of compliant citizens began to show severe degradation of neural tissue. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and emotion, shrank rapidly. Synaptic activity in the hippocampus, the center of memory, fell into sharp decline. Doctors, those still capable of forming complete thoughts, called it neural dissonance syndrome, but the public called it the flicker. It started with small lapses. People forgot conversations they had just finished. They left stoves on, wandered outside without shoes, forgot how to spell their own names. Then it got worse. Names vanished entirely. Places became unrecognizable. Entire blocks of memory fell away like dead skin. People began confusing dreams with reality, even though they weren't dreaming. They would insist they had visited places they'd never been, held jobs they never had, married people who didn't exist. Conversations looped. People repeated the same sentence 5 times in a row, unaware. The line between present and past eroded. You might walk into a grocery store and find a man frozen in front of a shelf, staring at a can of beans, unable to remember why he came or what a can even was. Or you might meet a friend on the street, only for them to greet you like a stranger, speaking in phrases that make no sense. The grass is awake today, one woman whispered as she handed her baby to a passing stranger, convinced the child had turned into an alarm. Hospitals tried to treat the symptoms with neural stimulants, cognitive recalibration, even targeted memory injections. Nothing worked. The brain, once deprived of its nightly cleansing cycle, began to poison itself with toxins meant to be flushed out during sleep. Amyloid plaques built up. Tau proteins tangled. Even the youngest, healthiest minds began to rot from within. Mental institutions overflowed, and not just with those officially diagnosed. Society at large had become a waking asylum. People staggered through streets in disjointed groups, murmuring nonsense, twitching with phantom dreams. Some reverted to childlike states. Others developed full psychosis. The sound of crying was everywhere, not the crying of sadness, but the hollow, echoing sobs of people who didn't know why they were crying. Panic attacks became daily rituals. Hallucinations grew common. You might see someone shouting at the sky, swinging at invisible enemies, or walking into traffic while laughing. The line between public space and mental breakdown vanished. Cities no longer felt like centers of civilization. They felt like shared delusions. Relationships fractured instantly. Without emotional regulation, people became volatile, erratic, paranoid. Friends abandoned each other mid-sentence. Families stopped talking altogether. There were no more deep conversations, no meaningful apologies, no lasting bonds. The emotional bandwidth required for intimacy had evaporated. People could not process joy, loss, or even guilt. They lived in a state of permanent overwhelm. Touch felt wrong. Silence felt hostile. Even eye contact became unbearable. Social cohesion collapsed, not because people didn't care, but because they had lost the neurological capacity to care. The workforce, once the engine of the sleepless society, began to crumble. Call center employees screamed at silent phones. Programmers wrote thousands of lines of unusable code. Medical professionals performed surgeries in the wrong locations on the body. Air traffic controllers hallucinated planes that weren't there. Factory workers wandered into machinery. Pilots forgot their destination mid-flight. Corporations replaced as many people as they could with AI. But certain roles still required human decision-making, and those decisions were no longer reliable. When an entire population begins to lose grip on reality, trust becomes extinct. You couldn't rely on your coworker to remember your name, much less save your life in an emergency. Government, too, began to lose its mind. Lawmakers introduced contradictory policies on the same day. Voting records became corrupted with gibberish. Leaders gave speeches where words melted into nonsense. A prime minister in South America began speaking in a made-up language and refused to leave office, convinced he had become a biological clock. His cabinet let him stay because no one else could remember how to govern. State departments forgot to renew emergency protocols, failed to restock food supplies, and let utility systems degrade. Trash piled up. Power outages stretched for weeks. Roads buckled from neglect. The digital infrastructure rotted as server technicians lost the ability to troubleshoot. The world no longer ran, it convulsed. Religions morphed into erratic cults. With the death of dreams came a new wave of prophetic delusion. People began to believe that sleep was not only forbidden, but evil. Street prophets roamed cities in torn robes, screaming about the dark gods of Rem. Others claimed that humanity had entered the final phase of ascension, and those who slept were betraying the next level of evolution. Small towns became ruled by charismatic figures who claimed to be wake saints, offering neural clarity through sermons made of static and code. Their followers worshipped loudspeakers, wires, and televisions left on all night. They called sleep the Great Surrender and killed those who succumbed to it. The body, too, began to collapse. Sleep is not just mental, it is physical repair. Without it, organ systems began to fail. Heart conditions surged. Hormonal imbalances became rampant. Libido vanished. Women's menstrual cycles stopped. Testosterone plummeted. Immune systems fell apart. A minor cold became lethal. Minor wounds became infections. People coughed blood in the streets and kept walking. Bones grew brittle. Hair fell out. Skin became thin and gray. You could see people decaying in real time, rotting from inside as their body fought to function without a nightly reboot. You watched all of this while battling your own demons. Your thoughts repeated themselves endlessly, chasing their own tails. You saw faces melt when you blinked. You began to hear music when no music played. You started to forget the shape of things, what a table was, what time meant, who you were. You began to wonder if sleep had been a dream all along, something you had only imagined. Your reflection looked unfamiliar. Your voice echoed with delay, and eventually the fear left, not because it went away, but because your mind could no longer hold on to it. Emotions dulled to static. You felt nothing, not hope, not terror, just nothing. And still, the law remained. The world demanded wakefulness. But even as the adult mind unraveled, there was another horror quietly forming in the background. A new generation born into this madness who would never know dreams at all. The adults were breaking, but they at least had memories of what sleep once felt like. The children did not. Born into the wake age, raised under synthetic light and strict compliance regimens. They were the first generation to never know a full night's rest. Their minds developed under constant pressure, constant motion, constant sound. Sleep, to them, was not a need, but a punishment, a threat, a crime. From the moment they were born, these children were monitored like prisoners. In maternity wards, newborns were fitted with retinal monitors and cortical wake sensors. Nurses no longer used lullabies. They used alert tones. Cribs were outfitted with motion-triggered alarms that activated if the infant's brain activity dropped below prescribed thresholds. Instead of soft music or quiet lights, they were surrounded by stimulus, high-contrast projections, synthetic language loops, and tactile feedback systems designed to keep their neurons firing at all hours. By the time they were toddlers, most of these children had already developed signs of severe neurological instability. Emotional regulation was nearly non-existent. They could not express joy in conventional ways. They smiled with a twitch, not out of happiness, but because their facial muscles were trained to mimic social cues. They screamed unpredictably, sometimes for hours, not out of pain, but because their brains had no other way to process constant input. The education system tried to adapt, introducing neurostim classrooms where students sat in individually isolated pods, wearing focus helmets that bombarded them with rapid sensory exercises. But the results were devastating. Children began exhibiting symptoms of psychosis by age 4. They would invent elaborate stories about invisible insects, speak to walls, or refer to themselves in the third person, sometimes as entirely different characters. The line between fantasy and reality was never formed because dreams had never taught them the difference. Language acquisition faltered. Without the sleep-driven consolidation of memories, most children struggled to retain vocabulary. They could mimic phrases, repeat commands, but true comprehension lagged far behind. Teachers reported a new condition they dubbed cognitive drift, where students could learn a task in the morning and forget it entirely by afternoon. Social interaction was another casualty. Play was replaced with regulation exercises. Games were measured in efficiency metrics. Group learning was discouraged due to the erratic behavior it triggered. By age 6, many children had already been isolated into one-on-one behavioral conditioning. They did not hug. They did not laugh. They did not dream. And when they did collapse from exhaustion, it was in terrified silence. Their small bodies twitching violently as if fighting an internal enemy they could not name. Parents were helpless. Most of them were already mentally frayed, barely functional, kept alive only by the mandated stimulant programs and artificial adrenal triggers. They could not console their children because they themselves were no longer emotionally intact. Family bonds became fragile routines of feeding, dressing, and monitoring. Affection became performance. You might see a mother smile at her child, her face trembling from forced exertion, her voice reciting state-approved affirmations like a broken machine. I am proud of your wakefulness. You are a strong, alert citizen. But beneath the surface, fear ruled. Parents knew that if their child fell asleep outside of the allowed 3-hour window, their family could be flagged. Multiple offenses could lead to juvenile extraction, a polite phrase for forced relocation to state care facilities. These facilities were the stuff of whispered nightmares. Officially called cognitive compliance centers, they were located in remote zones, away from cities, guarded by military-grade drones. Children sent there were subjected to full-scale neural conditioning. VR, wakefulness, simulations, electrocognitive rewiring, and emotional dampening therapy. Reports occasionally leaked out. A former technician described rows of children strapped into learning chairs, pupils dilated, repeating phrases for hours while their heart rates were tracked by biometric AI. Another whistleblower claimed that some children were given experimental brain implants designed to suppress REM entirely, ensuring they could never enter dream states again. The goal was simple: eliminate the need for rest by rewriting what it meant to be human. Yet, even these draconian measures could not mask the truth. The children were not adapting. They were breaking faster than anyone expected. Pediatric exit attempts surged, though most lacked the understanding of what they were doing. Some children stopped eating. Others clawed at their skin, convinced something was crawling beneath it. A popular toy line had to be recalled after hundreds of kids claimed the dolls were whispering to them in the dark. But it was not the toys. It was their own hallucinating minds. Some families fled, retreating to rural or unmonitored zones to try and give their children rest. They formed small, hidden communities known as sleep sanctuaries, deep in forests or abandoned industrial parks. These places were illegal and regularly raided by the sleep police. But for a while, they gave children a taste of what real rest felt like. In those rare moments, something miraculous happened. A child who had never spoken clearly might suddenly say a full sentence. Another might laugh unprompted or draw a picture of something they had only seen in their mind. But it never lasted. The moment they were discovered, the sanctuary was destroyed, and the children were taken. What happened to them after was never known. Worse still were the wakeborns, infants conceived under the influence of artificial hormonal regimens and raised entirely within the 3-hour system. Their brains developed differently. Autopsies of deceased wakeborn children revealed shrunken hippocampi, malformed amygdalas, and irregular cortical development. They had no capacity for long-term memory, no comprehension of dreams, and no natural instinct to close their eyes. They would stare at light bulbs for hours, unblinking, until their corneas burned. They would wander rooms with perfect silence, unaware of danger or comfort. Some did not cry. Others never stopped. The few who reached adolescence became something else entirely. Hyperreactive, emotionally blank, and almost impossible to communicate with. One researcher, in a rare moment of unfiltered honesty, referred to them as neurological ghosts, and yet society celebrated them. They were held up as the future evidence that a sleepless species could survive. Schools paraded their most responsive wake-born students, demonstrating their reflexes and memorized scripts. But behind the forced smiles and perfectly rehearsed words, there was nothing. No spontaneity, no warmth, just scripts and compliance. These children would grow into adults who had never known rest, who could not remember, feel, or dream. And that future, more than anything else, signaled the death of humanity's soul. But even as these children were molded into biological machines, others were waking up to a different truth. One that hid in alleys and underground clinics, where people dared to break the law, dared to sleep, and dared to fight back. In a world where sleep had become the ultimate crime, rebellion took the most forbidden form imaginable. Closing your eyes, even for a few minutes, in defiance. Deep within the cracks of the sleepless society, a hidden world emerged. It did not advertise itself. It did not use signs, nor digital footprints. It existed in coded gestures, secret frequencies, and hand-carved symbols etched into alley bricks. This was the black market of sleep, a fragile, flickering resistance movement, not built on weapons or ideology, but on dreams. In a society where every second of rest was tracked, restricted, and punished, the right to sleep had become sacred. The earliest black market sleep dens began as modified sensory isolation rooms. These weren't luxury spas. They were converted storage units and sewer basements lined with stolen insulation foam, electromagnetic dampeners, and crude biometric blockers made from hacked hospital equipment. The goal was simple: trick the system. People would enter through disguised doors, behind dumpsters, beneath vending machines, or through maintenance hatches in abandoned buildings. Once inside, the world changed. No blue light, no alarms, just padded silence, dim warmth, and the blessed absence of motion. For the first time in months, even years, people could lie down, close their eyes, and let go. But they had to be quick. Sessions were timed. Most only lasted 15 to 20 minutes. Access to these dens wasn't bought with money alone. You needed to be trusted. You needed clearance codes, biometric masks, and often a recorded sacrifice video of you publicly denouncing sleep crime as a cover. Once inside, you were assigned a minder, someone who monitored your vitals and stood ready to administer stimulants if drones got too close. These minders were often ex-medical professionals, disillusioned by what the world had become. They knew the stakes. If caught, both sleeper and minder would be arrested and permanently flagged. And yet, more and more people came. CEOs, surgeons, teachers, children, even law enforcement officers. Everyone was breaking. Everyone needed rest. And the black market was the only place left to find it. Over time, the movement evolved. It wasn't just dens, it was tech. Black market engineers began crafting illegal devices, biojammers that masked REM cycles, skin patches that slowed the body's signals to evade detection, and neural bypass headsets that mimicked wakefulness in brain scans while the user slept. These devices were sold in underground auctions or through encrypted peer-to-peer networks known only to trusted circles. Entire guilds formed to manufacture and distribute them. Coded as dreamsmiths, they operated mobile workshops that traveled between cities disguised as waste collection drones. Each device came with warnings. Malfunctions were common. Some caused memory loops, others triggered seizures. But for most, the risk was worth it. A few moments of unconsciousness was more valuable than gold. Still, the system fought back. The sleep police deployed advanced anti-sleep tech, from airborne EE sweeps to synthetic scent triggers designed to detect shifts in autonomic response. Public campaigns branded black market sleepers as dream addicts, claiming they were diseased, dangerous, and treasonous. Raids intensified. Dens were burned. Operators were executed in public squares as examples. One infamous event, dubbed the Dream Purge, saw an entire apartment complex destroyed after a single basement den was discovered beneath it. Hundreds died. Surveillance footage showed the building glowing with heat signatures, too many bodies at rest. It was enough to justify complete erasure. But the movement didn't die. It spread. Digital networks carried stories of forbidden dreams, of people who saw oceans, lovers, music, and memories again. These stories became fuel. People began writing down their dreams on walls, in stairwells, inside bathroom stalls. They drew images of beds, clouds, and stars, symbols of rebellion. Songs were composed in secret, played on analog instruments, describing dreams long forgotten. The resistance took on an identity. They called themselves the Restored. Entire zones of cities became silent battlefields between the state and the restored. In the underlayers of old subways, communities of sleepers began to form. They weren't just using the dens, they were defending them. Armed with scavenged tech and makeshift defenses, they created deep sleep vaults shielded by heteroducing gels and signal-dampening fields. These places could allow sleep cycles up to 90 minutes, enough to reach full REM. Scientists in hiding began documenting recovery. Subjects who experienced a full REM cycle began showing signs of emotional clarity, language recovery, and even partial reversal of neurological damage. For a moment, it seemed that sleep could still save humanity, but time was short. Each raid grew more precise. Each restored camp that fell was a catastrophe. Outside the movement, most of the population remained unaware or too broken to care. They believed the propaganda. They watched televised confessions of captured sleepers, forced to admit they had committed treason against wakefulness. But occasionally, even in the most controlled spaces, cracks would form. A child would ask about a dream they had during an illegal nap. A worker would be caught humming a song they couldn't remember learning. These moments spread quietly, like ripples through still water. And when they reached the right person, they became rebellion. There were rumors of a final sanctuary deep in the northern forests, shielded from drones by geomagnetic interference and camouflaged under layers of ecological decay. They said it was called the Cradle. No one knew if it was real. The location shifted in every retelling, but those who believed claimed the Cradle was a place where sleep was sacred again, where full nights passed in silence and dreams returned with color. Some even claimed that the people there had begun remembering who they once were, that children could laugh, that art had returned, that silence no longer felt like a threat. But finding the Cradle was nearly impossible. It required weeks of travel through dangerous zones, bypassing checkpoints, feeding on dry nutrient paste, sleeping in 30-second intervals to avoid detection. Many died. Others disappeared. Some were captured, their minds broken in re-education. But a few made it. You hear their voices on pirate frequencies, soft, slow, steady voices telling stories from their dreams. They speak like poets now, not like survivors. They speak of memories, of forests, of rivers under starlight. They speak of sleep, not as a risk, but as a right. But as humanity fought to reclaim its rest in secret, the world outside was changing too. Nature itself was beginning to crack under the weight of artificial wakefulness. And soon, even the earth would begin to unravel. Sleep is not just a human function. It is a biological constant interwoven into the very fabric of life on Earth. When humanity outlawed extended sleep, it triggered a cascade far beyond city walls and corporate towers. The artificial rhythms imposed on people began to bleed into the natural world. At first, no one noticed. The focus remained on productivity, enforcement, and compliance. But outside the glowing grids of sleepless cities, nature began to suffer. Slowly, quietly, then all at once. It began with light. In order to sustain constant wakefulness, the world had become a planet of eternal day. Cities no longer dimmed. Skies glowed all night. The stars vanished, smothered by waves of synthetic illumination that flooded forests, oceans, deserts, and mountains. Migratory birds, whose internal compasses depended on celestial patterns, began to lose their way. Entire flocks veered off course and crashed into high-rise buildings that shimmered with blue-white glare. Others simply circled endlessly above urban centers, confused, exhausted, and finally falling dead from the sky. Nocturnal animals were the first to vanish. Bats, raccoons, owls, and insects that thrived in darkness found themselves lost in a world that never slept. Their ecosystems disintegrated as feeding and mating cycles collapsed. With no true night, their internal clocks desynchronized. Predator-prey balances failed. Creatures began reproducing at the wrong times, hunting during biologically inert hours, and dying in large numbers. One study, leaked from a suppressed environmental journal, estimated that over 70% of nocturnal species had gone functionally extinct within the first 2 years of the Sleep Act's global enforcement. But the ripple went further. Coral reefs began to bleach at accelerated rates, not just from warming waters, but from altered light patterns transmitted through satellites and underwater sonar systems. The reefs, sensitive to lunar cycles and circadian chemistry, were confused by artificial pulses that mimicked perpetual day. Without rest, even the sea began to die. Plankton, the base of the marine food chain, failed to perform their nightly rise to the ocean's surface, starving larger species and breaking the loop of life that had sustained the planet for billions of years. Plants, too, began to rebel. Artificial light disrupted their photoperiodism, the delicate timing that tells them when to bloom, release pollen, or go dormant. Crops grown near cities began producing at erratic intervals, some fruiting out of season, others refusing to germinate at all. Farmers, pressured by corporate mandates for constant yield, pumped their soil with artificial stimulants, UV mimics, and synthetic hormones. The land responded violently. Soil microbiomes died. Earthworms vanished. Fungi failed to form symbiotic networks. Without these underground collaborators, plants grew brittle, shallow-rooted, and nutrients-starved. Entire agricultural zones turned barren, not from drought or fire, but from exhaustion. Animals exposed to urban sleep suppression technology showed signs of neural decay. Domestic pets, dogs, cats, even birds began exhibiting erratic behavior. They attacked their owners, paced constantly, refused to eat. Some dropped dead with no warning, their hearts giving out after weeks of disrupted rest. In rural areas, deer were found wandering in circles, their pupils fully dilated, their bodies covered in lesions from aimless collisions. One viral video showed a zoo elephant standing completely still for over 36 hours before collapsing. Autopsy revealed complete nervous system shutdown, death by sleep deprivation. Yet the human world responded with denial. Scientists who warned of ecological collapse were labeled dream radicals or anti-productivity terrorists. Their institutions were defunded, their studies suppressed. A few disappeared entirely. Government agencies replaced independent research with AI-generated climate models that only reported favorable outcomes. These wake-conscious environmental reports praised the adaptation of nature to the new rhythm, claiming that life was evolving beyond the need for rest. But those who ventured outside the cities knew the truth. The forests had grown silent. The insects were gone. The birds no longer sang. The wind moved through branches, unbroken by flutter or chirp. In mountain regions, the glaciers melted faster, not only from heat, but from round-the-clock industrial activity. Energy plants, no longer throttled by nighttime dips, operated at full capacity every hour, belching steam and carbon into an atmosphere that no longer had a chance to cool. The polar zones, once a haven for sleep-regulated species like bears and seals, now echoed with empty winds. Hibernation had become impossible. Bears emerged early, starving and aggressive. Seals failed to reproduce. The great migrations of caribou and whales halted mid-route, confused by magnetic disruptions from the endless digital signals flooding Earth's crust. Even the insects, the smallest cogs in the planetary engine, began to vanish. Bees failed to navigate their paths to flowers. Their sleep cycles, essential for memory and communication, were broken by ambient electromagnetic interference. Without bees, pollination rates fell. Without pollination, plant life suffered. Without plant life, the dominoes fell faster. Butterflies died out in swarms. Ant colonies fractured. Moths flew into the lights of cities until their wings burned. The silence became deafening. Entire ecosystems collapsed without a single bullet fired or tree felled, only by removing the dark. And then came the swarms. Those creatures that did adapt to the sleepless light mutated grotesquely. Rats grew larger, their bodies tougher, their minds more erratic. Without predators, they filled the void in the cities, forming aggressive colonies that moved like packs of wolves. Locusts began breeding year-round, no longer waiting for seasonal cues. They swept through farmland in black clouds, devouring crops already weakened by erratic growth. Nature had not surrendered. It had become something else, fractured, hostile, feral. Yet even as this unraveling continued, humanity refused to stop. The global wake economy demanded constant input. If the Earth no longer cooperated, then the Earth must be redesigned. Climate modification satellites were launched to enforce synthetic seasons. Forests were trimmed and sterilized to eliminate sleep-prone species. Animals were genetically edited to suppress rest cycles, creating creatures that were awake but barely alive. Corporate biologists began designing pets that never blinked. A child's toy monkey that never closed its eyes became a global hit. Parents praised its wakefulness. Children copied it. But deep beneath all of this, something ancient stirred. The planet itself, so long held in balance by the push and pull of light and dark, was beginning to protest. Magnetic fields shifted erratically. Earthquakes struck sleep facilities built too deep underground. Ocean currents drifted off pattern. Coral spores began blooming in odd shapes, spirals, runes, warnings. Nature was not just reacting. It was rejecting humanity's attempt to sever sleep from existence. It was preparing, in its own quiet way, to wipe the slate clean. And when nature could no longer sustain the weight of wakefulness, it wasn't the forests or oceans that collapsed first. It was the cities, the proud monuments of sleepless ambition that fell like dominoes. The collapse of cities did not happen in one moment. It was not a single catastrophic event. It was the slow unraveling of every structure humanity once believed unshakable. From above, the cities still glowed, brighter than ever, humming with drones, advertisements, and synthetic sky flares. But beneath the surface, they were hollow. Their cores were rotting. What was once hailed as the pinnacle of civilization, glass towers, suspended monorails. And soon, the foundations gave way. It began with critical infrastructure, the systems that kept cities alive, power grids, water pumps, sanitation, and emergency services were managed by humans already pushed beyond biological limits. Sleep-regulated automation was once a safeguard. But after years of neural collapse and mass resignations, those systems fell to low-functioning overseers with flickering minds and compromised coordination. Operators forgot protocol. Maintenance crews missed crucial service intervals. Utility AI went unpatched, glitching from data drift. Streetlights blinked erratically. Elevators stalled between floors. Traffic management failed entirely. Emergency dispatches misrouted calls to abandoned stations. People stopped reporting fires, accidents, or structural collapses because no help came. The first major city to fall was Lagos, with a population in the tens of millions and a density higher than most nations. It had survived plagues, droughts, and wars, but it could not survive the law. When a core water treatment facility failed due to technician blackout, it sent millions into a panic. Hydration plants malfunctioned. Riots spread through the city as citizens fought over hydration tabs and electrolyte vials. The sleep police attempted to enforce order, but many of them were just as compromised. Footage leaked of officers collapsing mid-raid, guns still raised as they hit the ground. Within a week, entire districts had burned. Thousands vanished. The city never recovered. It was a pattern that repeated across the world. New York's financial district fell when thousands of traders, already erratic from stimulant use, triggered a catastrophic data error that wiped out 3 stock exchanges in a single day. London's underground transport system collapsed after its operators miscalculated track changes, derailing trains and sealing commuters inside tunnels for hours. In Delhi, overburdened servers failed, leaving the city in digital darkness. No lights, no maps, no communication. Entire hospitals lost access to patient data, dosages, or equipment calibration. Thousands perished not in chaos, but in silence, alone in dark rooms, no longer wired to remember they existed. Even automated cities failed. Tokyo, once hailed as a marvel of machine precision, began malfunctioning when its biometric monitoring systems glitched, mistaking low pulse rates for sleep violations. Citizens were electroshocked in the streets. Car AI refused to start without perfect compliance scores. Automated security bots attacked infants for lying too still. One survivor described the city as a computer hallucinating death. As collapse spread, people began fleeing the cities, but the countryside offered no safety. Agricultural zones had already failed, overrun by locusts and stripped of nutrients. Highways were clogged with broken-down transports and scavenger mobs. Fuel was scarce. Navigation systems dead. Entire regions were reduced to foot travel, with refugees staggering through what remained of their world. Red-eyed, paranoid, delusional. Some tried to sleep as they walked. Most simply stopped and laid down on the side of the road, eyes open, unmoving. They weren't dead. Not yet. Just locked in cognitive shutdown. A new form of living coma. Then came the structural collapses. Without maintenance, buildings began to fall. Towers leaned and crumbled. Bridges buckled. Streets split open. Entire neighborhoods sank into sinkholes caused by unchecked groundwater shifts. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Morgues overflowed. But the most haunting part was how little people responded. When a tower crumbled in Seoul, killing hundreds, nearby citizens just kept walking. They did not scream. They did not run. They stared, whispered to themselves, or tried to carry on conversations with people who no longer existed. They were past fear, past pain, past understanding. They were shells. Crime surged, not because of greed or malice, but because of mental collapse. People stole without remembering why. They attacked others without provocation, sometimes mid-conversation. Some wandered naked through malls, singing or sobbing or shouting slogans from old commercials. The sleep police could no longer keep up. Their own ranks were failing. Enforcement drones flew in erratic spirals or hovered endlessly above empty lots. Surveillance hubs lost connection to hundreds of zones. The global wake network flickered offline in massive regions. In desperation, cities began deploying neural lockdown fields. Electromagnetic pulses meant to stun large populations into compliance. But these only caused seizures, death, and total memory blackouts. Religious centers, once twisted into pro-wake cults, became sites of mass suicides. People gathered under banners of the final rest and ingested toxic sedatives together. Others lay in pews, clutching pillows, waiting for sleep to take them one final time. Their prayers were not for salvation, but for dreams. And still, the city governments insisted on continuity. Hollow announcements echoed through the streets, urging citizens to remain productive. Together, we wake. Together, we thrive. But there was no one left to listen. The screens kept glowing. The drones kept flying. The buildings kept humming. But the people had become ghosts, drifting from task to task, without memory, without meaning, without rest. By now, you would be wandering too, your mind fraying, your skin dry, your heartbeat uneven. You would step over bodies without blinking. You would talk to strangers only to realize they are statues, frozen in biological limbo. You would hear whispers that are not there. You would begin to forget what cities used to be, what homes meant, what your own name was. You would forget why you stayed awake so long. And then comes the end, not in fire or flood, but in silence. As the last remnants of consciousness flicker and fail, humanity finally collapses into the sleep it tried so hard to escape. In the final stage of a civilization without sleep, there is no explosion, no war, no reckoning from the heavens. There is only the quiet unraveling of thought itself. One by one, the lights remain on, but the minds behind them go dark. Not through death, but through erasure. What humanity feared most, the complete surrender to unconsciousness, comes not as rebellion, but as inevitability. Sleep, once outlawed, returns not as luxury, but as the instrument of extinction. You do not survive the end. No one does. Because what collapses last is not the city nor the system, but the soul. By the time the final collapse begins, most major cities are already empty. Not in the physical sense. There are still bodies, still movement, still noise. But the people are no longer truly alive. They walk, they breathe, they respond to basic stimuli, but nothing registers. What remains are biological husks governed by lingering reflexes. You see them in the streets, standing at crosswalks that never change, whispering to blank billboards, typing into dead terminals. No one remembers where they are going. Most do not even remember who they were. The streets hum with flickering lights and broken voices looping announcements from systems that no longer understand their own purpose. Wake up. Stay productive. Wake up. Stay productive. But no one is listening. The black market sleep dens have gone silent. The restored, once a beacon of hope, have faded into myth. The cradle, whether real or imagined, is no longer reachable. It too has succumbed, or perhaps was never truly there. What remains are fragments, stories told in half words, drawings on walls with no explanation, dreams that flickered for a moment and then vanished, never to be recovered. Even those who tried to rebel through rest have succumbed to the same decay. Without enough infrastructure, without enough bodies to defend or supply their sanctuaries, they too fell to starvation, infection, or madness. Sleep alone could not save them. It came too late. Governments no longer function. There is no law to enforce, no policy to debate. The last bureaucratic enclaves flickered out when their own staff began to forget how to log into systems or feed themselves. Digital currencies lost all meaning. Identification systems collapsed when people forgot their names. Communication satellites kept broadcasting data to receivers no longer in use. Global positioning systems spun endlessly, locating nothing. The very concept of society, shared agreement, collective reality disintegrated. Without memory, there is no future. Without sleep, there is no memory. The final stage is physical. Human biology, deprived of repair for too long, simply gives up. Organs fail, immunity crumbles, muscles atrophy, hearts stutter and stall. Even the most aggressive stimulants, once used to prolong function, now only accelerate decay. Those few, still semi-conscious, stumble through hollow buildings, mouths open, eyes dry, skin peeling. Some try to eat, but forget how others talk to invisible friends. Simply lie down, no longer afraid. Their final sleep is not peaceful. It is a shutdown, violent, fragmented, full of flickering noise and buried confusion. There are no dreams at the end, just static, and then silence. The earth remains, the cities, too, for a time, overgrown, crumbling, light still flashing, sometimes in forgotten towers, screens still glowing in empty homes, but the people are gone, not buried, not mourned, just absent, as if they were never truly there. No historians survive to record the fall. No archives remain intact. Data decays, batteries drain. Nature creeps in, slowly reclaiming the world. Roots crack pavement. Birds return, timidly, at first. Rain washes away advertisements. Time does what sleep once did. It erases, gently, with persistence. And what is left behind? Not legacy, not glory, only a warning etched into the bones of a planet that to fight sleep is to fight life itself, that dreams are not weakness. They are the foundation of meaning, of memory, of identity. You do not survive this future, not because you are weak, but because you are human, and to be human is to need sleep. It is not optional. It is not negotiable. It is the boundary between being and unbeing. And once that boundary was destroyed, so were we. Now that the last light of humanity has gone out, all that remains is one final question. How did we ever think we could live without sleep? You have seen the world after sleep was stolen, not by war, not by nature, but by policy. You witnessed how a single decision to limit rest to 3 hours unwound everything. Society, biology, memory, love. You saw cities rise into glowing monuments of efficiency, only to crumble into silent graveyards of forgotten faces. You felt the descent as minds fractured, as children lost their ability to dream, as Earth itself rejected the rhythm-less beat of artificial wakefulness. And in the end, you understood the truth. Sleep was never a weakness. It was the quiet architect of sanity, compassion, resilience, and meaning. It was the invisible hand that kept the gears of humanity aligned. In this dark mirror of the near future, humanity's refusal to rest became its extinction event. A crime not written in blood, but in exhaustion. A genocide not of people, but of dreams. And as the last minds fell into the silence they had spent their lives avoiding, the lesson echoed louder than any law or machine ever could. Sleep is sacred. Without it, we are nothing. So the next time you close your eyes, remember what this world might have been. If rest became illegal, if sleep became rebellion, if dreaming made you a criminal, if this vision disturbed you, intrigued you, or made you think differently about something as simple and as essential as sleep, then help us spread the message. Like the video, share it with someone who never misses a night's rest. And subscribe for more immersive explorations into terrifying, beautiful, and thought-provoking alternate futures. Because every ripple starts somewhere, and the next world we show you might be even closer than you think.